everyone. So happy Monday and welcome back to class. I just have a couple of quick announcements before I jump into the lesson today. So first of all, good job on the exam. If you haven't figured this out, Econ 221 is one of the harder classes in the business kind of core, so keep pushing through. If you aren't super happy with your grade, the good news is I weight participation very heavily in this class. So I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here since you're listening to this, but as long as you stay up to date on the exercises, that really carries you a very long ways in the class. If you would like help calculating your weighted class score, I'm going to give you the formula real quick so you can do the computation on your own. So the class has 30% of the score that's going towards exercises. So what that means is your score is going to be 0.3 times your percent on exercises. So if you have all of your exercises in, then this would be like a 100% you put in here. 20% of your class score is exam 1, so you would take 0.2 times your percent on exam 1. 20% of your score in the class is based on exam 2, so you'll take a 0.2 times your percent on exam 2. And then the last thing you'll need to add on to figure out your score, and this is where you can kind of play with the numbers to figure out what you need, is your score on the final. So the final counts for 30% of your overall course grade. So you'll add on to the end of this 0.3 times your percent on the final. So I guess I didn't need to write 30% here. So this is the equation you can use to figure out what you would need to get on the final to get a particular score in the class. Again, don't get super discouraged if you haven't been doing exceptionally on the exams. The exams are hard, so don't take it personally if your score wasn't super high. It's just kind of the nature of the beast in this class that it's a hard class. But that said, make sure you're still attending the classes because exercises, again, will really give you a big boost in terms of your overall course score. Okay, so that's announcement number 1. Announcement number 2 is, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip a couple of chapters in the textbook because some of the chapters aren't as important as others, and so I'm going to have to kind of prioritize things based on what is most important to know. So the last exam finished up on chapter 9. Normally we'd start in chapter 10, but I'm going to skip chapter 10 because it's not as important. And we're going to have to skip some, so we're going to skip 10. So what that means is today we're going to start in on chapter 11. And chapter 11 is not hard, so it'll be kind of easy on your brain today. The name of the chapter is Public Goods and Common Resources. Okay, so the idea for this chapter is when we've been drawing markets that have supply and demand, each of the markets reflects a supply and demand for a particular good. And so one thing we can do as an economic profession is we can characterize goods and put them in different categories. So we'll say, here's one category of goods, here's another category, and here's another category. And we're going to group the goods together based on their features. So there's going to be a couple of features that we're going to use to do the groupings. So feature number 1 is excludability. Okay, excludability is exactly what it sounds like. Excludability has to do with whether or not you can feasibly prevent somebody from consuming the good, or whether or not you can exclude particular people from participating in the market. So, for example, a good that is excludable is a can of beans at the grocery store. So unless somebody pays for the can of beans, they don't get to consume it. So you can exclude people from consuming a can of beans. A good that is not excludable is the water from a water fountain that's in a city park. So you can't exclude particular people from drinking out of the water fountain. That's not an excludable good. So the definition of excludability, or excludability has to do with whether a person can be prevented from using it, or it is the good. So whether a person can be prevented from using it. If they can, then the good is excludable. If they cannot, then the good is not excludable. So any good that you might think of in the world can either be categorized as excludable or not excludable. Okay, the second feature that we can use to classify goods is rivalrous. Whether the good is, all right, put like this, rivalry in consumption. Okay, so what does this mean? So if a good is rivalrous, which means there is rivalry in consumption, that means if one person consumes the good, then that good that has been consumed is no longer available for someone else to consume. So for example, an apple is rivalrous, because if I eat the apple, well then I've eaten it, you can't eat it. So as soon as one person consumes it, it's kind of burnt, it's done with. Something that's not rivalrous would be a good like a subscription to the New York Times. So if I pay for a subscription to the New York Times, that in no way prevents you from subscribing to the New York Times. So that good is not rivalrous because one person's consumption of it does not kind of prevent another person's consumption of it. So the official kind of way we think about rivalry and consumption is whether one person's use diminishes another person's use. Okay, so these are going to be the two features that we're going to be thinking about today. So again, every good can be classified as yes or no, is it excludable? And then yes or no, is it rivalrous? Or is it characterized by rivalry and consumption? Okay, if every good can be kind of characterized along these two dimensions, then that means there's going to be a total of 4 possible kind of defining features that will allow us to split any good into one of 4 groups. So a good might be excludable and rivalrous, one group. It might be excludable but non-rivalrous, another group. It might not be excludable but rivalrous, that's a third group. And it might not be excludable and also not be rivalrous, so that's the 4th group. So again, kind of based on how you characterize each good according to excludability and rivalry, we can kind of position it in one of 4 categories. Okay, so let me give you some examples here so you can understand excludability and rivalry. I'm going to just give you 4 different hypothetical goods, and we're just going to characterize them as whether they are excludable, yes or no, and rivalrous, yes or no. So good number 1 is wild blueberries. And we'll make a table here. So we'll have, the first column will be, is it excludable, yes or no? And then the second column, is it rivalrous, yes or no? Okay, wild blueberries. Can you exclude certain people from going to a forest and picking blueberries? No, because the bush is just there. So whoever comes and gets the blueberries first, they get it. So we're not going to like exclude. It is not feasible to kind of exclude particular people from picking the blueberries off the bush. So is it excludable? No. Are wild blueberries a good that are rivalrous? Yes, because if I get to the bush first, I eat them, they're no longer there, and so you cannot eat them. So while they're not excludable, they are rivalrous. Okay, another example. Cable TV. Okay, is cable TV excludable? Yes. For example, for most of my life, I did not have cable TV because I didn't pay for it. So I was excluded from getting the benefits of cable TV because I wasn't purchasing it. So it was excluded from me using something called a price. And so cable TV is definitely excludable. Unless you pay for it, you don't get it. Okay, is cable TV rivalrous? It is not rivalrous because as soon as I choose to purchase or pay for cable TV, it's not like my neighbor's cable gets turned off. So one person's use of cable TV does not diminish another person's use of cable TV. So it is excludable, but it is not rivalrous. Okay, another example is a seat on a flight. So suppose you want to fly to Denver and you have to buy a ticket, and that ticket affords you a seat on the flight. Okay, is that seat on the airplane excludable? Definitely, because unless you buy the ticket, you don't get that seat. Is it rivalrous? Definitely, because if I have the ticket for seat 14F, nobody else gets seat 14F because I have just consumed it, and there's only like one person that is allowed to consume that particular seat on the flight. So you can both prevent people from getting that seat, and then once one person gets that seat, it prevents anyone else from getting that exact same seat. The last example is a sunset. S-U-N-S-E-T. Okay, so a sunset is a good because it's something you can go outside and you can enjoy. You can kind of get some utility out of it. Is a sunset excludable? No. So you can't prevent certain people from going out and enjoying the sunset. Like, if you are a human being and you can see, like, you have access to the sunset. Okay, is it rivalrous? It is not, because if I go outside one night and I enjoy the sunset, that doesn't prevent my neighbor from doing the same thing. So it is neither excludable nor rivalrous. Okay, so this is going to give us 4 categories. So again, we take each of the features, excludability and rivalrousness, and we can kind of characterize each good as yes or no for each one of these things. This gives us 4 possible outcomes or 4 possible categories of goods. Okay, so category number 1. Some goods are classified as private goods. Okay, private goods are excludable and rivalrous. So, for example, a seat on a flight is a private good because you can exclude people from consuming it, and then once somebody consumes it, like, it's gone. You can't have someone else consume it. So all goods are characterized by excludability and rivalrousness are classified as private goods. The second category of good is public goods. Okay, public goods are the goods that are not excludable, and they're also not rivalrous. So, on our kind of list of examples, a sunset would be an example of a public good. So, sunset is not excludable and it is not rivalrous. Category number 3 is common resource, or common resources. Okay, common resources are those goods that are not excludable, but they are rivalrous. So that would be something that is consistent with wild blueberries. These would be a common resource. And then the 4th and last category we're going to call club goods. So club goods are those that are excludable, but they are not rivalrous. So cable TV is an example of a club good. Okay, so again, any good that you might think of in the world can be categorized based on its excludability and its rivalrousness in consumption. And then based on which kind of check marks you make, you can determine which of the 4 categories of goods that particular good belongs to. Okay, so the name of the chapter today is, again, public goods and common resources. So these are going to be the two categories of goods that we're going to kind of focus on. So public goods and common resources are these two things. These things share the characteristic that neither one of them are excludable. Okay, the non-excludability feature is going to kind of make goods a little bit weird because normally in most markets we exclude people from consuming a good based on who's willing to pay the price. So, for example, if you would like a seat on a flight, well, we can exclude people from the flight if they're not willing to pay the price for a ticket. Similarly, for cable TV, we can exclude people from getting cable TV if they're not willing to pay the price for it. So if it is feasibly impossible to exclude people from consuming a good, then that means prices aren't going to work. Like, we can't use a price to kind of kick some people out of the market. So think about the examples we have here. So we said that wild blueberries are not excludable. We also said sunsets are not excludable. Okay, that means we can't attach a price tag to these things. Like, there's no way for us to slap a price on this and to cause it to stick. So we can't somehow ever start charging for a sunset. Like, it's not feasible to do that. We also can't really charge for wild blueberries. Unless you go out and pick the wild blueberries and bring them home and start selling them, okay, then you can charge a price, but originally you went out and picked them. So while they're still wild, which is what we're looking at, wild blueberries, we can't kind of have a price that kicks some people out of the market and excludes them from participating. Okay, so this is going to result in kind of a problem. And the problem is when you cannot slap a price tag on something, then the amount of good that is either produced in the market or consumed in the market is not going to be right in terms of the quantity that we think would be optimal. So let me write some of this down so you have it in your notes. Okay, so what I just said, so again, you make sure it's on your piece of paper. Public goods and common resources are both not excludable. What that means is that they are available to everyone free of charge. What that means is there's no price attached to them. And furthermore, it's impossible to try to attach a price to them. So, when individuals decide how much of a public good or a common resource to either consume or produce, either they overconsume or underconsume, or overproduce or underproduce. They never pick the right quantity. So the words are, so when individuals choose how much to produce or consume, either they produce or consume the wrong amount relative to what is optimal. Okay, so I'll explain this in a minute, but for now, the big thing you need to just be aware of is when you can't stick a price on something and make the price stick, then when people are trying to either provide common resources or public goods or take advantage of them and use them, they never use or produce the right number. Okay, so let me kind of explain why this is the way it is. start with the case of public goods. These are maybe a little bit easier to think of. Okay, so for public goods, what the tendency is going to be, and this isn't always the case, but this is the general tendency. The tendency is that for goods that are categorized as public goods, people in the market who are providing the public good provide too little of it. So it's like the supply isn't sufficient, or it's not as much as we would optimally like to have. So public goods, or when we have public goods, there is a tendency for people to produce, or another way of saying this is supply, too little. Okay, so let me give you an example of a public good. So one example of a public good is military. So the idea is a military protection is a public good because you can't exclude protection from like certain people. You can't say, okay, Americans, if you live in Kansas, then the national the DOD is not going to provide protection to you. Or if you have straight hair, the DOD is not going to provide protection to you. So you cannot like exclude public protection from certain people. So military defense is the example. It is not really excludable. And it's also not rivalrous. So if we have a really strong military that go overseas, they win a war, me being protected from the enemy does not prevent my neighbor from being protected from the enemy. That's kind of weird to think about. But the idea is military defense is public good because it's both not excludable and non-rivalrous. Okay, so what we have said is that in the case of public good, there's a tendency for people to privately produce too little of it. Okay, so think about what this would look like. So suppose you are given a piece of land and you are allowed to kind of start your own country in this territory. Your piece of land is unprotected, so you need some kind of military. So if we left it to private citizens to kind of provide military support, you'd probably not have a whole lot of people who are just like chipping in money for the military, or you probably wouldn't have a lot of people who are just kind of like offering to supply military support because of the free rider problem. Okay, too little. So they provide too little because of the free rider problem. Okay, what is the free rider problem? Okay, the free rider problem is people can free ride, so they can receive the benefits of the public good, military defense, without having to pay for it, because if military defense is not excludable, then you can't really attach a price tag to it. So the free rider problem is people can receive the benefits without paying for it. So the idea is if I am living in this brand new country and somebody else kind of chips in for military support, well, whatever support or whatever defense is provided is going to be realized by me. Like, I get the protection of a strong military, even if I don't chip in. So the tendency is that there's going to be too few contributions to the military if we're trying to use a private market to kind of supply military defense. Okay, so the way we get around this, so I'll call this the solution, and particularly it's a solution to the free rider problem, is the government can just come in and provide the public good. So this is what we do in the United States. This is what virtually every country does. Virtually every country has a military system that is financed by the government. Okay, think about this. Why does the government pay for the military, but the federal government does not pay for your can of beans? The reason is because a can of beans is a private good, so the market can have supply and demand intersect, figure out the price, and then people who want the can of beans will just pay the price, get the can of beans. But for military, you can't attach a price tag to having a certain number of units of protection, and then people go into the military market, pay a certain amount for military defense, and then each person is protected, because military defense is not excludable. So people we can't slap a price tag on it. There's a free rider problem where as soon as any military service is provided, people can just take advantage of the benefits without paying for it. So we get too little military defense when it's just people individually trying to provide it or kind of set it up on a private market. And so the solution is the government just comes in and they say, okay, we're just going to provide military defense because without us providing it, the country is going to have too little military defense provided. Okay, all of that is to say the solution is sometimes the government directly provides it. Okay, so this is example number one of the two categories that we're going to look at today is public goods. Okay, so what about common resources? So common resources are going to be characterized by people having the tendency to consume too much of them. So recall that common resources like public goods cannot really be exchanged well in a market because we can't stick a price tag on it without it falling off. So for common resources, there's the tendency for people to consume too much. Okay, so let me give you an example of a common resource so you can kind of see this. So a couple of examples of common resources are fish in a river, and if you like to go hunting, then quail might be an example of common resource. So the idea is for both fish in a river and quail, they're not excludable, they're just out in the open. So if you want to go fishing, you can't prevent anyone from doing that. If you want to go hunting and shoot birds, you can't really prevent anybody from doing that. But they are rivalrous. So as soon as I reel in one fish, well, when I take that fish home, no one else can catch that fish. Similarly, when I shoot one bird, that bird is done for, someone else can't shoot it. So these are examples of common resources. Okay, for goods that are common resources, there's this tendency for people to over-consume them. So what that means is naturally there's a tendency for people to kind of fish too much and shoot too many birds relative to what is optimal. So what is optimal? The idea is that in order to have any fish in the river, you need a sufficient supply in the river so that the fish can breed and keep the supply of fish coming. So if everyone goes out to the river and pulls in all the fish, well, suddenly there's no fish left in the river. There's no fish to kind of breed and create more fish, and so we have overutilized that natural resource. Similarly for quail, if people go out and hunt all the birds, there's not going to be birds to have more birds, and so they're over-consuming this. So the solution to this problem is frequently governmental assigned property rights. So in the case of fishing, you have to get a permit. The reason for the permit is because we want to kind of restrict how many fish are fished. So the government is smart enough to know that for fish in a river, there's a tendency for people to overconsume them, to take all the fish out so that we no longer have a fish supply. So they say you have to get a permit in order to go fishing. Those permits are intended to kind of keep the population of fish at a sufficient level so that we continue to have fish. Similarly, for other kind of wildlife that are hunted, there are seasons when you can start hunting particular animals. So there is a quail season, before the first date of the quail season, you are not allowed to go out and shoot quail. If you do, then the government can come after you. The reason for the defined seasons is to prevent hunters from going out and over-consuming that particular wildlife, because we need a sufficient number of it so that it can continue to breed. Okay, so the solution are things like, or the solution is the government can sometimes assign property rights. And examples of property rights are fishing licenses and hunting seasons. Okay, so the big takeaway from this chapter, I kind of went through this quickly. The big takeaway is that based on a good's features, there's going to be 4 categories of goods. So we have 4 categories of goods. For 2 of the 4 categories, the good is defined by non-excludability. If a good is defined by non-excludability, that means price tags won't stick on the goods. Like there's no way you can feasibly charge a price for a person to consume the good. That messes up everything we've learned so far in this class, because we've been talking about supply and demand, which gives you an equilibrium price, and price has been this like incredibly strong tool to reach an equilibrium quantity. Well, if you throw prices out the window, then we don't have that tool to get us to the appropriate quantity. And so without that tool, we don't get to the right quantity. Either we over consume or we under provide. And so depending on what type of good we're looking at, public good or common resource, the government tries to come in and intervene in the market to kind of get us back to the appropriate quantity. One way they can do that is by assigning property rights. Another way they can do that is by just providing the sufficient number or units of the good on their own. Okay, so today is not a super mathy class, which may be early for you. It's kind of more conceptual. If any of this doesn't make sense, let me know in the next 10 minutes, and after that, we'll meet back for the exercise. Okay, the exercise today is going to be pretty short and sweet. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to consider each of the following four goods. And then for each of these four goods, I want you to tell me, first of all, whether or not that good is excludable. So can you prevent certain people from consuming it? Second of all, tell me whether the good is rivalrous. So if one person does consume the good, does that prevent somebody else from consuming it? And then third, I'd like you to tell me what type of good it is. And so your part 3 answer is going to be based on whether the good is excludable or rivalrous. So the goods I'd like you to consider are, first of all, the secret recipe for your grandma's cherry pie. Is that excludable? Is it rivalrous? And what kind of good is it? Number 2, sunshine. Number 3, tickets to the NBA Finals. And number 4, gold in the mountains of California. So this is what prompted the California Gold Rush. Was that gold in the mountains excludable, rivalrous, and what type of good was it? As I mentioned, just for the sake of time, I'm going to have to kind of skip some chapters in the textbook. So the next chapter, kind of chronologically, is chapter 12. We're going to skip chapter 12. So what that means is for next class, your reading assignment is to go ahead and read chapter 13. Chapter 13 is super important, so make sure, again, you're actually doing the reading. It'll be helpful for understanding. So get the questions answered, read chapter 13 throughout the week, and I will see you back for next class.